not going to go into that in as much depth as I had planned. Some of what I'm going to talk about today is inevitably colored by my personal experience of 9/11 when I was attending law school in Boston, which was the launching site of 2 of the 9/11 planes, and my work in the years afterwards as a lawyer representing a number of Guantanamo and Bagram detainees. But in these comments, I will speak less as a lawyer and more as a cultural critic, which was a job I had in a previous life. I'm going to look at the process of what I call othering Islam, creating Islam as an external threat against which the resources of another group, in this case the nation state of the United States, against which it organizes itself in what is perceived as a defensive way. I'm going to talk about this process as taking place through 3 simultaneous separate processes, which are called separating, alienating, and essentializing. There is more to say than I can possibly say here, so I will offer at the outset that I'm using some broad strokes and that I'm speaking from the perspective, the outsider perspective, of a sympathizer to the Muslim Arab communities, but by no means as an expert or insider. I want to begin this analysis of othering Islam by suggesting that we think about 9/11 in terms of what might be called an epistemological trauma. Trauma, it is well known to therapists and counselors, is an encounter with an overwhelming harm or threat of death. All traumas may be considered epistemological, that is, involving our systems of cognition and knowing, in the sense that they disrupt and overwhelm systems of meaning that are created to use to make sense of human reality. Traumas typically disorganize the capacity to tell the story of the trauma in a coherent narrative. And it has been established that trauma may be experienced in cultural as well as individual terms. I'm going to suggest that 9/11 was an epistemological trauma in a specific sense, in that the attack was undetected by the mechanisms of knowing that were specifically framed to provide advanced warnings of events of that type. That is, the intelligence and national security institutions designed to protect the United States homeland from physical attack. 9/11 thus engendered a crisis of knowing, a crisis of intelligence in a literal sense. The epistemological crisis was expressed in layman's terms through the metaphor that gained currency in the aftermath of 9/11, of the inability to connect the dots. But 9/11 was also an epistemological crisis in a more metaphorical sense, in that it thrust into the awareness of average Americans a region of the world about which most were totally ignorant. The epistemological trauma of 9/11 erupted from within the safety of assumptions that Islam was an inconsequential and backward faith that could be safely ignored. And I've passed around a few copies of the cover of, a couple of covers of the New Yorker magazine that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of paragraphs, just to refresh your memory. I'm sure these are well known, and there's one on the front and one on the back. The brilliant post-9/11 New Yorker cover redrawing Manhattan as an Afghanistanized island called New Yorkistan elegantly dissected the shock with which a previously invisible culture had suddenly interjected itself into American cognitive framework. The cover's transposition of cultures, of imposing Afghanistan and other countries from that region upon a map of New York, at once rendered the strangeness of New York and America's sudden preoccupation with a pre-modern country and its inhospitable, craggy terrain, while critiquing the cultural blindness that had caused that transposition to seem so cognitively jarring. And of course, the New Yorkistan cover recalled another, older and yet more famous New Yorker cover, which is on the back of the handout, mapping America and the world as a receding horizon, falling away from an outside image of New York. That earlier cover parodied the New Yorkocentrism of Manhattan dwellers, but that calm pre-9/11 world is devoid of any evidence of the Middle East, or indeed of any world outside of the United States, except at a very great distance for China, Japan, and Russia. Islam was not a natural other for the United States. Arabs were not central to any of the great streams of immigration in U.S. history, and Islam brought to the Islam brought to the New World with African slaves did not survive continuously into the modern age. As of 2011, the Islamic population in the United States was less than 1%, though growing rapidly, in contrast to Europe, where it is 6% overall, and up to 20% in some cities. And unlike Europe, which has a long